Okay, let's go ahead and get started again. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. For those of you who weren't here this morning, my name is Catherine Rihimäki. I'm Associate Director at the Council on Science and Technology, and I'm the MC, which will basically just be transition between the really important people who are the panelists. So, this morning we had a great opportunity from hearing Janet Eckelman speak about her beautiful fabric artwork to panelists who were talking about asking questions as well as taking risk. And now we are moving on to our third panel, which is Form Beyond Function. And our last panel, Rebecca Napolitano reminded us that this is something that people have been playing with, form and function, for millennia. And we are carrying that through to today. Janet spoke about taking fishing nets that have a particular form for a particular function and then transforming that in her artwork to be these beautiful, as she described it, sculpting with wind, sculptures that play with wind and light. And I wanted to point out one other way in which we are playing with this concept, which is our program today, which we could have just done a normal booklet, but instead Constance Old, who's here somewhere, maybe she's not in from lunch yet, but she designed this for us both as a program, but also if you fold it out, it is a poster of one of the works that Janet spoke about, a detail from her Dreamcatcher sculpture. And so we hope that you think about this form beyond just the function of telling you what today is all about and when to be where. So with that, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Jeff Snyder, who will be in charge of panel 3. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. So yeah, we are going to start out with some slides, and we're each going to talk a little bit about our own work. We're going to talk about one piece that we made that somehow intersects with this topic, and then talk about one piece that someone else made that intersects with the topic, was the original plan. All right, so let's start out with Martha over here.
Hello? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Sigrid. Thank you, everybody. This is an exciting opportunity to talk about something really important, this intersection of arts and engineering, and specifically now form and function. My name is Martha Friedman. I'm a sculptor. I'm the director of the visual arts department. I'm going to sort of try and stick to what you just told me to do. Like a little, I messed with the form a tiny bit. That's what I do. So this is not an artwork. This is 2 videos. On the left is an image I took at a rest stop in Delaware where the nacho cheese machine was on the fritz. And on the right is an experiment done by some engineers to try and depict how cats drink water. And as far as I understand, dogs lap up the water. Humans form a suction, but cats can do this much more precise thing with their tongue where they dart it down and just lift a column of water up using the tongue and the surface tension of the water, and then chomp it when it's sort of in mid-flight. So I sort of would like to use this as a description of sort of how I see both the art, or the artist and the engineer, or form and function sort of reflecting on each other or putting some pressure on each other. When I think of classical notions of beauty and aesthetics, my mind travels to Platonic ideals of beauty, perfect forms. Beauty was equated with forms that had ideal ratios. This kind of beauty was bound to the mathematical. Sculptures were touted, studied, and replicated based solely on mathematical ratios of their parts. And this beauty was often contrasted with art, a dirty and misleading seductress, often associated with poetry. Despite the noblest efforts of the engineers who designed this machine on the left, the real, or reality of the cheese itself and the environment of the convenience store, the well-thought-out functionality of this machine has succumbed to real life. I'd also like to add that the cheese would not naturally appear this color. This skeuomorphism of the yellow, denoting perfectly organic cheddar cheese straight from the farm, is a form that has been added to the processed cheese product that is used to fill this machine. So on the right, this is a purely functional video. The purpose of it was simply to illustrate the physical properties and mechanics of cat drinking. But I find it mesmerizing. The form of this purely functional video is beautiful. So I'm really attracted to things on the left as an artist that are disgusting, repulsive, also super seductive, are pushing the boundaries of etiquette or just their sort of predetermined limits. On the left is a piece by Annie Albers made in the early 40s. It's part of her hardware necklace series. It's made from a drain cover and some paper clips. And on the right is a piece by me called After Annie Albers, which is a 6-foot steel disc with holes drilled in it and steel tubing bent in the form of paper clips. A quote from Annie Albers about this series is, she says, "The freedom to see things detached from their use as pure materials, worth being turned into precious objects." She's interested in separating form from function and using common objects to do that. So I liked putting these two things together because she repurposes a very functional pedestrian object into sort of an art object or a necklace or body adornment. And then my sort of switching of that, or my second recontextualization or reinterpretation, is less a recontextualization and more of a shifting of the form into a different scale and material, but mostly scale. So in some ways, I'm also really interested as an artist of using form to poke and prod at function, almost in an antagonistic way. So use form to sort of pull out and take apart and push functional objects into a kind of realm of failure, but leaving them somewhat recognizable, like leaving there sort of a referent of the original use function of the thing. To queer the function, to use a trendy term. But before you start it, I'll say, could you put it back to the very beginning? Great.
Things like
this is a part of a video. It's part of a work I made that usually is projected on a large sheet of rubber. It is Silas Reiner, who's a dancer choreographer, in my studio working inside very large, oversized cast rubber bands that I made. And the audio you will hear is Richard Feynman passionately describing what rubber is.
most elastic things like steel springs and so on is nothing but this electrical thing pulling back. You pull the atoms a little bit apart when you bend something, and then they try to come back together again. But rubber bands work on a different principle. There's some long molecules like chains, and other little ones that are shaking all the time, that are bombarding them, these chains. And the chains are all kind of kinky and knocked about and shake. When you pull open the rubber band, the strings get straighter. But these strings are being bombarded on the side by these other atoms trying to shorten them by kinking them. So it pulls back. It's trying to pull back, and it's pulling back only because of the heat. So if you heat a rubber band, it'll pull more strongly. For instance, if you hang a weight with a rubber band and put a little match to it, it's kind of fun to watch it rise because it heats more. And there's another thing you can check that this idea is right, that it's heat that drives a rubber band. If you pull the band out, just like when we push the piston in the gas, if you pull the band out, the tightening string hitting those molecules makes them move faster, and so it's warmer. And if you take the band and let it in, then the molecules hitting the strings which sort of give as the thing hits, they give in to the soft like, and they lose energy when they hit these retiring strings. So it cools. And there is a little way you can do this. You're not very sensitive. It's a small effect. And if you take a fairly wide rubber band and put it between your lips and pull it out, you'll certainly notice it's hotter. And if you then hold it out and let it in, you'll notice it's cooler. At least you'll notice a certain difference in what happens when you expand it, when you contract it. And I've always found rubber bands fascinating to think that when they're sitting on an old package of papers for a long time, holding those papers together, it's done by a perpetual pounding of the atoms against these chains to hold it, trying to kink them year after year. Well, rubber bands don't last that long, but anyhow, for a long time, trying to hold this whole thing together.
He goes on to say, the world is a dynamic mess of jiggling things if you look at it right, and something about being really lucky because we see things at the scale that we do. We see things as things. So I'll just end by saying, when we talk about form and function, it is usually from experience distant and theoretical points of view. But when an artist makes a work of art that addresses form and function, we magically collapse the space between theory and practice and come to a very experience-near interaction with one person's unique take on this particular form and this particular function. And this is art. And this is what art and poetry do in contrast to the beauty of science and engineering, and they are both invaluable.
So much. Maybe, yeah, let's maybe jump around a little bit. Let's go to Doris, if that's okay.
Okay, it's my turn.
Yep, let's see. You might have to turn on the switch.
So I'm an architect. I work, what I do generally is I use smart materials and try to develop them for buildings, in facades, in structures, in different ways. And work directly with engineers and also overlap in the arts. And you'll probably see that in at least this piece of work that I have here. This is a project that I did. Actually, it was completed and shown in 2012 now. It's an older project, but I decided to put this up because it actually starts to show you, again, more directly this idea of the combination or a non-combination of form and function, where probably of anyone on this panel, those are two words that we use a lot in architecture. So this was a pavilion that, like I said, was built in 2012. We went through a ton of iterations to try to determine what to build at this site. We had to deal with these site issues and application. And working with the engineer, the big stipulation of the site is we were not supposed to touch any of the buildings to the side. And so we started to build this surface that would behave, to any engineer, as a shell and gain structure just by the shape of it and the form of it. And once we did that, we decided, well, why don't we be experimental and break it down into different grids and make a lot of smaller hypar shapes or hyperbolic paraboloids. So that was something that was very new. We decided to change the overall shape because then the owners of the gallery said, oh, by the way, you can't touch the back building either. And so we had to change it again. But then we started building this thing where we had other issues because it's outdoor. We had lateral wind forces that would make it behave like a sail and it would just take off. So that we kept working on trying to move between the gridding and the overall form. Before we actually mirrored it to itself so that it could be a self-supported, freestanding structure in itself. So you can see here, working with all the different kind of technologies. I think Janet brought up in one of her images the idea of red is bad and blue is good, and trying to control how much the pieces would project out, how the different materials in different area of the surface would behave and produce before we came up with the final form itself here. It also has to do with structure and assembly systems that we went through and dealt with in engineering, called the monocoque structure, so that it's super lightweight and that we can make it out of very small panels and not large members. And we have to build everything ourselves, so that's why there's the innovation in how that's done. And so here, which didn't translate, is a material that we work with, which is a thermal bimetal. And basically, it's a lamination of two different metals together and has different coefficient of expansion. So when the temperature goes up, the reaction is a curl. And so this is supposed to be a video that shows that. Didn't see that one. We used a lot of computation so that every single piece on the entire project, which is about 14,000, was identified to be associated with digital heat modeling. You can see here there's panels that were structured, held down tight. We did all these studies of how ultimately in the end the function of it was to actually shield from the sun and apply shading below as well as ventilate. So here's our early models. You can see in this case, the sun would hit everywhere that's red. The blue in this case was where it was in the shade. So we can lighten up and optimize the different surfaces. You can see in areas that we didn't need it, it became very porous. And this is another video where the innovation was actually in building it too. So the way that we assemble it also informs how the form comes about. Basically, you can see here there's a big ring that we made and built the whole thing from the ground. So we stood on the ground, built it together. Oh, there it goes. And you can see the panels being put together, zero skill, student labor. Built this thing that's about at the highest point 7 meters tall. So you can see we just keep going around and around and keep lifting this ring. We never could touch any of the side of the building. We built the biggest thing possible before actually landing it on its feet on the ground in the end.
Were the neighbors antagonistic? Is that why you?
Oh, absolutely. There's the building on the right here, there's actually an opening and a balcony, and the guy there came out every day to watch us to make sure we never touched his building. And we came to about, it's about a foot away from his building, because again, we tried to make the biggest structure we could in this courtyard. It was actually almost comical. We would watch him and he would watch us and he would never talk to us. So anyway, that keeps going, and then we finally set it on its ground. Again, I said there's about 14,000 pieces, and again, it's through computation and performance and optimization that we were able to make this a very lightweight structure. It's estimated to be maybe about 500 pounds total, which is almost nothing. So we had an uplift problem more than a gravity problem. This is another video where you actually see it through the course of a day, a time lapse very fast. The best part is you can see the shadow going back over. Maybe it'll play. Oh, maybe it won't. That's okay. And there you see it from above. The one thing I would like to say, we had an opening, and after I built this thing, and I called this a pavilion, someone came up to me and they said, oh, you're the artist of this sculpture. And I thought, what? Artist? Sculpture? This is not art piece. But then I realized a lot later that actually, in some ways, that was a compliment, because it was, in many ways, became a little more meaningful to people on their own level. That in some ways it was up for interpretation. Oh no, that's okay. Basically and then should I show the one that? Okay, so Jeff asked us to present one of our projects and also to present a project by somebody else. And I only have, you're running out of power. Oh, is it after this?
It's in the folder.
I guess that was it, sorry. So the one project that I threw out there was a project by Theo Janssen, and the reason why is because his projects, I aspire to dynamic movement like his react to wind, and he makes these very large, simply mechanical structures that react to the wind or by very small amount of force. And as you can see, a lot of the work that I showed, as well as almost all the work that I do, is what we consider passive or requiring zero energy. Because it moves, at least for me in architecture, is again looking at this idea of zero energy, and in many cases to either save energy or produce energy. So that's mine.
For next, we'll have Douglas Repetto.
Hi. So I'm just going to let the video play in the background. It's from a... Oh, okay. It's from a series of pieces of mine called Forever Wild, and this one is Forever Wild Nest Machine. I've written on my hand... You can turn the sound off, Jeff. Just on your laptop? Thank you.
Oh, I could have done it on
Anyway, I wrote on my hand disaster and fragility, so that's what I want to talk about. I have a garden. A few people have asked me about my garden at home already, and a couple weeks ago I planted, I live in Memphis, Tennessee now, and I thought it's time, so I planted cucumber seeds, and it was reasonably warm, and a few days later the cucumber seedlings started coming up, and it was very exciting. And then last week we had a frost, and I know you all got hammered by some snow on the East Coast, but we had a frost, and the next morning I went out, and the cucumbers were, they were dead. They were brown and wilting, and it was very sad. But they were still there, right? There was still something there, even though this kind of disaster had struck. And what I want to say in the context of this conference and our panel about form, I want to not talk at all about the kind of what you might call the content part of what the pieces are about, although they're definitely about something. I more want to say that one of my main ideas when I'm thinking about how to make a piece is to make them kind of like those seedlings in that they can survive various kinds of disasters. They can have a kind of fragility, but that they can be in the world the way the world is, which is that things are going to happen. People are going to climb on them. Drunk guys are going to spill wine on them. The power is going to go out. We've all gone to exhibitions where someone, the projector lamp goes out and the video piece doesn't exist anymore. Or the computer crashes in the middle of the performance and the performance doesn't exist anymore. And that's a kind of fragility, I think. And behind the scenes, although I work with lots of natural materials and recycled materials, I also work a lot with computation and building circuits and things. And one of my least favorite parts of all that is that fragility. It's so easy. Right before I left, we had a jar of water spilled on the laptop episode at my house. It's a disaster that's really hard to recover from. And I really aspire to make work that can withstand those, that still exists, and that exists at lots of different levels, and gives people so many different points to engage with the work, the title, the materials, the way I made the knots, that even if the power goes out, or the thing gets broken, or half of it falls down, it actually is still meaningfully there. The way for me, my garden, I'm constantly having disasters in my garden, but my garden never goes away. In our kind of real world, there's no such thing as going away. There's changing. There's radical change all the time, which you have to deal with. But there's no physical things don't just blip out of existence, right? And so that's really something I aspire to. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the poet Terence Hayes that some of you might know. If you don't, look him up. He's fantastic. And I had the great pleasure of hearing him give a reading in Memphis 2 nights ago. And I'm not going to read you any of his poems. I just want to tell you a little bit about something that happened at the end. He has this series that he calls, a new book coming out this summer called American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin. And it's something like 70 poems, and they all have that exact same title. So during the reading, he kept saying, this next poem is American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin, and over and over again. He got to the end, there was a question and answer, and he was just about done. And then the last question was, a woman said, do you think of your poems as something to be read on the page, or do you think of them as something to be listened to? And he said, well, since you asked that question, I'm going to read this other poem that I left out because I didn't know what to do with it. And it was this poem that he said I have to read it twice, and that's why I didn't read it, because he doesn't know what to do about it. He read it once, just word after word after word with no line breaks, no form. He just read the words straight through. And of course your brain put things together and pulled out meanings and grouped things together. And it was a poem about something, and you made meanings of it. And then he read it a second time as it's written on the page with formal line breaks, and it was a completely different meaning. And this was something he did on purpose. He was playing with this, he knew this, but he was really uncomfortable with this thing he had made. He had kind of made a formal gesture that he didn't know how to present yet, and he didn't like it as something you would listen to, because he thought it was kind of clunky to have to read it twice. It was like, that's not the right gesture. If I haven't done it right, if I have to kind of, it's like describing the punchline of a joke to someone. They should just get the joke. You shouldn't have to go back and explain it to them. And he also didn't quite like it on the page, because you might never think to do this. And to me, that was really exciting to see someone that I admire so much that is working at such an incredible level, who can still make things that he doesn't know what to do with. He formally, it's like, it's 2 poems. They're both really good poems. And then when you realize they're 2 poems, it's even more interesting. So he made this gesture that he's confused by. And that, to me, is super exciting, the possibility of doing that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go over to Graham here. Why not?
Okay.
You can use the clicker. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Graham Burnett. I teach. I'm on the faculty here, and I trained in the history and philosophy of science, and I teach in the history of science program here. And then I also was involved in the group of faculty who helped create the interdisciplinary doctoral program in the humanities, what's called IHUM, which is a new interdisciplinary project here at Princeton that's run now for, I think, maybe 8 years or something like that. And my slides went away. So I think of myself as a kind of mixed. Oh, I think of myself as a kind of mixed maker. I definitely am interested in and do scholarship, which is to say, I think about the past and how you get access to it and what you can do to recover things from the past and make them now somehow. And I do that as a professional historical scholar some of the time, but I'm very interested in other ways of getting access to the past. And I've had a long-standing studio practice that articulates with my historical and academic interests in ways that I myself don't really understand and shouldn't trouble anyone else. Certainly not you, okay? So you're safe. I took the instructions for today's session very literally. I'm going to present a work by somebody else and then a kind of work of my own. But I thought I would offer to the subject, form and function, the mixed, impure, messy category of the essay. Many of you will know that the word essay means kind of try in French, and the term as a way of describing a kind of written thing derives from the kind of French politician and belletrist Michel Montaigne, a Renaissance figure. But we all also know kind of essay films and other kind of essayistic forms. The essay as form is a really interesting question, and also the title of a famous piece by Adorno, which I'm going to quote in a moment. May I have the next slide? Oh, wait. I have the clicker. I'm in control.
Yourself.
Et voilà. So I'm going to give you just a couple of quotes to get the question of what essays are in the room. The essay form has not yet today, 1908, translated from the Hungarian, the essay form has not yet today traveled the road to independence which its sister, poetry, covered long ago. The road of development from a primitive, undifferentiated unity with science, ethics, and art. All right? And in an essay that is sort of an extended commentary on Lukács, I'm just going to pull 2 quotes. To the instinct of scientific purism, every expressive impulse in the presentation jeopardizes an objectivity that supposedly leaps forth when the subject has been removed. Okay, I'm going to read that again so we're like all kind of in it. To those who are possessed by an instinct toward scientific purism, to such people, every expressive impulse in a presentation, in the making or presenting of something, jeopardizes the objectivity that supposedly leaps forth when the subject has been removed. For those of you who've read like Galliston and Daston's interesting book on the history of objectivity, this will ring true. There's a way of thinking about objectivity that's about kind of getting yourself out of it, okay? It's not the only way to think about objectivity, but it's a powerful one. It thereby jeopardizes the authenticity of the object, such eruptions of subjectivity, which is all the better established, meaning the authenticity of the object, the less it relies on support from the form, meaning like what work you did to make it appear like an object, despite the fact that the criterion of form is whether it delivers the object pure and without admixture, paradoxically. In its allergy to forms as mere accidental attributes, the spirit of science and scholarship comes to resemble that of rigid dogmatism. But although art and science have separated from each other in history, their opposition is not to be hypostasized, made kind of, don't get too excited about it and make it feel too real, eh? The disgust for anachronistic eclecticism, meaning icky mixes of all kinds of shit that doesn't belong together, does not sanctify a culture organized according to departmental specialization, although universities are thusly organized. And if you're interested in this, I teach a graduate seminar in the fall called Interdisciplinarity and Antidisciplinarity, which is sort of kind of about that. The whole class is kind of like a comment on that sentence, maybe. In all of their necessity, these divisions simply attest institutionally to the renunciation of the whole truth. The whole truth. Okay, so that was just kind of to get you thinking about some things I think about. I'm going to talk about a film by an artist who's kind of, very successful, Camille Henrot, French artist. This is a film that showed at the Venice Biennial a few years ago. It won the Silver Lion or the Golden something. It won all kinds of things. 13 minutes long. I can't show it to you because Camille is extremely rigorous about stopping people from seeing stuff that they kind of haven't like bought, and it's a film, so you can't see it. But I can show you a couple of stills from it. This is a 13-minute video that kind of has the feel of looking at a computer screen. Has different, how many of you have seen this piece? Okay. It has the feel of looking at a computer screen in which windows keep popping open as you sort of search for information or open files or pop open videos. And there's an amazing soundtrack which is sort of sung, spoken, poetic word piece. And you get a little feel for its kind of Vatic ambition in those lines. Beginning, there was no earth, and I can't read it to you because we don't have time. But it's an affecting kind of account of inquiry into things and the showing thereof. And it has a couple of moments like this in which all the screens coordinate into these tessellations that are really quite majestic. Okay, so that's her piece. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is that I was asked to kind of write a criticism of it, to write a work of critique. And I'm going to show you what I did, which is a kind of mixed genre. It's sort of a piece that responds to a piece that looks a little like a work of criticism but isn't. It's a piece called Screen Capture. And to understand it, I'll just give you quickly the opening. The Loebner Prize in Artificial Intelligence is awarded annually to the chatbot software that achieves the highest score on a formal Turing test, which assesses, this is me writing this, okay, how successfully a computer emulates human discursive engagement in an open-ended, open-topic, natural language interaction. A beta version conceptual project slated for entry in the 2017 Loebner competition, CritBot, aims to reproduce salient features of art critical discourse and has been envisioned as an app suitable for use on phones or tablets in galleries and museum settings. A projected commercial version will allow visitors to conduct real-time critical dialogues in a chat format as they make their way through a given exhibition, substantially replacing, it's to be hoped, formulaic and hierarchically pre-recorded tour headsets, uneven docent guidance, and the vagaries of human companionship. The use of the system in arts writing remains largely unexplored. For this essay on Camille Rowe's film and video work, CritBot's developers afforded me, D. Graham Burnett, experimental access to the current CritBot build, which I used as an interlocutor and foil, blah, blah. Okay, so basically the piece, which I don't have time to read you, is a discussion between me and this chatbot, which is kind of doing criticism while I watch the piece. So I watch the piece and I try to describe to CritBot what's happening, and CritBot like asks me questions. And I'm about to be cut off, but in essence, you can. Can I read one last sentence? The experience of a kind of psychosis of information access is what the piece attempts to both reproduce in what Camille Rowe has done and pivot off of her in a different direction away from. What's your perspective, CritBot keeps asking. Immersed, and this is what I think makes the essay important now, immersed, without distance. Gross fatigue has much in it of the feeling of thinking now, of inquiring now, of trying to understand now. At moments it conveys a dizzying sense of the poetry that might be made from the language of now, a poetry that could express or convey something of the experience of now, to ride across some portion of the surface of the all, for it is all surface, crumpled to a plenum of perfect density, to note the duration of a portion of such a trajectory and record it as an artifact or gift, to let the question of who's driving come along like a small fetish god carried unceremoniously in a gunny sack, think Yojo, Queequeg's hapless idol. This may be the very best we can do now. And CritBot asks, who is we? Thank you.
Yeah, so next we have Jingwen.
Hi everyone, I'm Jingwen. I make wearables, and I've been asked so many times like what type of the wearables you make, and I feel it's really hard to answer like what type of wearables I make, but I know like what they're not. So I make wearables that's not the device, that's not for fitness tracking, that's not for notification, which basically says that like what the stuff I make basically have really not many functions. So this is a project called My Heart on My Dress, and the idea is that it takes my diary input, and so I write diary during the day, and then it send all the text through sentimental analysis API, which you can just think it as a piece of code running somewhere and analyze what I wrote, and then give this dress an indication on like what color and what pattern this dress needs to show up. And the analyzed result is all about emotions, which means in this case, I use blue color for negative emotions and use orange color for positive emotions. So this is a project that I got the idea from my own diary experience, where I use a lot of colors to draw or like doodle different thoughts, or some are really like very emotional, or some are really meaningless. So I had this idea of like, what if I visualize them on the clothing I wear every single day, then how will that affect my interaction with other people around me? So I started to research on how to build this dress that can change color. And then in terms of changing color, it doesn't mean that shining LED is in front of your face, but it's like the material itself really changes color. So I did a lot of research and solved a lot of like technical issues, and I finally draw this. Which one? So I draw this diagram, which also doesn't really make sense because this kind of diagram is always to explain a certain functionality, but in this case, it doesn't really have that many functionalities. So, and basically, I have an app that I write the diary in the app, and they send all the text information to the server where everything got analyzed and then got sent back to the JAWS. So this is a diagram I built, and I explain them to makers and to artists, and I noticed that this is not the right language for either of them because on technical level it's such less information, and on an artistic level, like artists won't really show this kind of really nerdy diagrams. But anyway, so okay, so another interesting experience in this project is that I choose screen printing as the technique to print the fabric with thermochromatic pigments. So because this dress is designed for myself, so no matter form or functionality, they're all for myself, and which means I only need one of this dress. Mass production of the method won't work, or at least it won't work for now. So I turn to all the traditional crafting methods, which are perfect for a small amount of production. For example, just printing this one fabric that makes this one dress. And but the photo I'm not showing is that I also made a printed circuit board because I also need a circuit to drive all the color changing patterns, which I also did it by myself with some acid and etched them on copper board. And they're similar experience, but in terms of design a layout and then put them into use some material, like there's some chemical reaction in it, but we always think screen printing is crafting, but we never think about printed circuit board is also a crafting method. So again, this is my work, and I hope that you can kind of have a sense of like what kind of wearable I make. So I co-founded a studio called Wearable Media, where we explore a lot more around like different form of wearable or like fashionable technology with functions that's not either notification or fitness tracking. So. And then I'm gonna show you a work that and the work that's not done by myself. This is work done by Iris Harpen, who is a fashion design. We always think her as a fashion designer, but the language is or the materiality she uses is often around non-traditional like fabrics or textiles. So she uses like laser cutting, 3D printing, and etc. And for this project, this artwork crystallization, she used a thermal forming technique. So the reason I picked this is because especially when it comes to like fashion or fashionable technology or wearable, people always think, oh, this is a 3D printed dress. But when, at least so far, like when I share Iris Harpen's work with other people, and we always talk about the form, and we always focus on the design, the form, and then we always know that it just happens to be this is done by 3D printing. So I think that's something I'd like to share with the audience here. And yeah, I hope that's everything I want to share.
Thanks very much, Jingwen. And next we're gonna have Sigrid Adriaenssen.
All right. I'm holding many things in my hand, so I'll try not to drop any of them.
Try to open it.
Okay.
See what we get.
So I'm going to present two projects. One that I worked on actually before I joined academia, and then I'll present the work of an artist that I admire. Oh yeah, I have to press the buttons. Okay, so this is the Dutch Marine Museum in the Netherlands, and it's a 17th century gunpowder house. This dates back from the time when the Dutch were a very wealthy seafaring nation. And in 2005, well, after it was a gunpowder house, it became a prison, and then it became a museum. And so in 2005, the museum was being renovated, and they held a design competition to see whether they could come up with a way to cover the courtyard. What you're looking at now is computer drawing. You are looking down, it's a plan view, and you see that the building is really like a courtyard, right? So there's a building here, a building here, a building here, and a building here, and this space is open. And as some of you might know, Amsterdam is kind of at the same height as London, lots of rain, lots of not very nice weather, and so they wanted to expand the use of the museum by incorporating the courtyard into the museum space. Now, we went into the museum and found this 16th century map. So obviously in the 17th century, 16th century, 17th century, when the Dutch were doing all these exploring of the world, they made a lot of maps. They developed map making and all kinds of sciences. And for example, we found this map. Now, so they were kind of here, they would go along here. This they got totally wrong. But what's kind of interesting is besides a overview of a worldview at that time, you also see there's actually a geometric pattern on that map. So you see there are 16 points. There's one here, one here, one here, and I can go around on a circle, and there's a central one, and all these points are connected together. And what this represents is actually a way that the Dutch thought that the winds were blowing, right? This is a windrose pattern, so they thought that the winds would start here and then kind of go this direction or this direction or this direction. And so they would use this map for when they were going in their boats, right? They would go along these routes because they believed that there were strong winds blowing along there. So we thought it was interesting. There's this kind of old map, which is a geometric pattern. And as you remember, the courtyard is kind of square. It's 90 feet by 90 feet. So we thought it would be very cool if we could use that pattern in the roof structure that we are going to propose to cover the courtyard. Now, I don't know if you know this, but actually you cannot span 90 feet with a flat shape. So we were thinking, okay, we have to develop this into a cupola. We have to give this a curved form, because curved, like arches, is much better. And so what we did is we were thinking what would be the ideal shape for a cupola. And we used actually a principle that dates back to the Robert Hooke, I believe it's the 17th or the 17th century, who said that if you want to do the ideal shape for an arch, you have to take a catenary, like this one here, which actually looks like Albert's necklace, right, a chain. But, if you could somehow take this shape, and when it comes to standstill, if you could freeze it and turn it upside down, you would end up with a catenary shape, which is an ideal shape for an arch. Now, we're not interested in an arch. We're interested in a three-dimensional form. So we modeled this flat piece here as a system of springs. They are supported at the corners, and we applied loads to it, just like the same idea as a catenary, right? We have a line, it weighs a certain amount, we let it hang down, we freeze it, and then we turn it upside down. Of course, we didn't do this with a physical model. Antonio Gaudí was doing similar things with physical models. It took him 6 years to build the models. We didn't have 6 years, we had 2 months to develop the design. So we did this numerically. I was very happy because actually I just completed my PhD and we used the algorithms of my PhD, so I felt I did something useful in life. That was great. So we ended up with this inverted shape. We froze it, turned the geometry upside down, and you end up with a cupola that's super efficient. Going a little bit forward, we won the competition, we built the thing. We did many algorithms also to get all the facets planar, so we could cover it with flat glass because that's cheaper than curved glass. And this is the built thing. This is if you lie on your back underneath it. I think you can see the map, right? But you also see how all these lines are really, really thin, and that is because the shape is very efficient. It's an engineered shape. It's based on physical principles of hanging models, and you end up with very small forces in those steel members, and so we can make the steel members very, very small. The other thing that we did is, what we did was at the nodes, you have here, let's say 6 members coming together. We inserted a node and an LED light that at night you can control. You see them all now white, but actually you take the whole variety of rainbow colors. And actually this summer I had the pleasure of being with Maria under the cupola. We kind of rented the space, kind of, for a whole day and a whole night, and we spent so many hours under the cupola, and it was really wonderful. And during the time when we were there were lots of schools coming in, and little children playing under the cupola. There were people that came in to have lunch, and so I think that is really a very satisfying feeling that people actually go out of their way to use or to be underneath your structure. In the museum, actually, Maria bought me a magnet. The cupola has become a symbol a little bit for the museum. I've been there before when it's on the tea towels, it's on the brill case, glasses cases. So that's really, I think, very satisfactory if you see that if you design something that has to cover the courtyard and let light into the building, actually it also achieves more than just kind of performance criteria that you can measure. Okay, so far the roof of the Dutch Marine Museum. I want to show this work also by the artist Shia Armajani. He was born in 1939 in Tehran in Iran, and afterwards obviously he moved to the United States, to St. Paul's, Minnesota, and he took a degree in fine arts, and he uses mostly painting and sculpture or small models to express his political and social ideas. And so what you see here, these are models of bridges. I've also done bridges, but this is a bridge over a tree. If I look at this from a kind of engineering perspective, this does not look very much like a bridge, but actually it is a bridge, and I'll tell you why. So this is the model, this is the physical structure. He built them sometimes full scale, and I see a typing mistake, I'm sorry. He very much builds his philosophy on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, who has a whole thing about a table is a thing, etc., etc. So Shah Armajani kind of paraphrases that with a bridge. He says a bridge is a thing, it's something in between that has a public shadowy side until it becomes public. What is before, after the bridge, above the bridge, and below the bridge brings them together and makes them one neighborhood, and a bridge is a part of a public landscape. And so, here you, for example, see some models from 1974, 1975. I have one more slide, where you see the house above, below, and then this is the last one which I want to show, because it's kind of interesting, like to think about what is really a bridge, right? Or what is supposed to do. If you go to civil engineering, they will tell you it has to do this and this and this. But for Shia Armajani, if you look at the model on the right-hand side, this is a model of a bridge, but actually, it's not, for him, it's not a true bridge, because you cannot really, you see here there's a great difference between here, and there's also a wall, so you can actually not cross, and this is one of the things that a bridge does, is cross from A to B over some kind of span. This bridge, or this is a model of not a true bridge, because it doesn't really connect two communities, and you cannot really cross it. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks so much, Sigrid. So I'm gonna skip my own presentation in the interest of time, but because I'd like us to be able to jump right into a conversation, and right now we only have 20 minutes left for conversation. So, right? What? Yeah. I'll show a really quick thing. So I guess I'm a composer and instrument designer, and my work kind of intersects arts and engineering in a lot of ways through my role in designing my own instruments. I'm particularly inspired by one who came before me who was a composer and instrument designer named Harry Partch. This is him, and he has a quote where he says he's a he's a philosophic music man seduced into carpentry. And I kind of like that, so I'm sort of like I'm a music man seduced into electrical engineering, basically, because I build electronic instruments. So I was going to show one little project that I work on was trying to build a wind instrument, my own version of an electronic wind instrument, and it's gone through a whole bunch of different forms. So the very first form looked like this, where it has this big wooden body. There's actually an electromechanical oscillator in there that turns around, and the breath is sensed, but then it like controls the amplitude of the electricity coming from this oscillator generator. It was very complicated in a lot of ways. And here was the original diagram of how it operates. And then over time, I kind of simplified it into this thing, the current generation of this instrument that I still call the Burl, which is just what I've been calling all of my wind instruments, is much simplified, and there's just kind of, it's basically a controller that talks to a computer, and then synthesis happens in the computer. And one thing that I find kind of, that I struggle with in the process of making this thing is thinking a little bit about what is important about this electronic wind instrument to me. What is it that makes it interesting for me to make it? And a lot of the early functionality that was unusual has been kind of like winnowed away, and now I've ended up with something that functionally is actually very close to things that are commercially available. You can buy an electronic wind controller that you plug into your computer, and it'll operate close to the way that this operates, right? The things that I'm adding to this technologically are very subtle. But I'm pretty interested in having a different form to what this takes, and this is sort of why I brought this up, where I was thinking, oh, like to me, so here's like a couple people playing it, and I was just thinking a little bit while preparing for this panel about sort of, what are the different details and like why did I make certain formal decisions and why are they important to me? So for instance, you can see on the left I was experimenting a little bit with doing some thread binding around the mouthpiece. So this is a traditional feature of a lot of wind instruments, but usually it's because it has a function, in a shakuhachi, that you cut the reed in half and then, put enamel on the inside to make it more resonant, and then you bind it back together, and you have to actually get the two halves into one tube. In this case, it's not. It's decorative, but I kind of wanted to make something that sort of harkened back to these original design things. And the other design element I was thinking about with it is I wanted it to be kind of like a rectangular box, and sort of all of the designs of this wind instrument have come from that sort of rectangular box idea. And that's really not a very wind instrument-like thing to do. And it's actually been kind of a struggle with the form and the function of this thing, where usually when I try it with people, I do want a lot of user input, but then like basically everyone says, I wish that these things were curved, and I'm like, yeah, it should be curved, but I really like design like this is Jakob Jensen, a Danish designer from the 70s, and I'm really into these kind of rectangular wooden things, and it's like, I just have these connotations and aesthetic interests that take me into directions that are actually probably not what it should be, And the other thing that I was thinking about is like, it's very important to me that, for instance, that it has a curved neck and that it's held this way. Whereas all existing electronic music wind controllers, you play like this. And there's just something about, to me, this is dorky. Sorry, clarinetists. And this is cool. So, I don't know. So for some reason, that form is really important to me, even though functionally it's really exactly the same. So the other thing I was thinking about, this is by someone else. This is by Namat Sahar. Douglas knows her too. She's a visual artist, and she creates these musical instruments too. And I was thinking a little bit on this panel about, okay, we were talking about form and function, but also Martha at one point when we were emailing back and forth about this, brought up the concept of content and meaning as, why are we leaving this out of this discussion? And that becomes kind of a problem if you don't think of it. And one thing I sort of like about her work compared to my work, where I think I really am kind of making tools, and it falls under this design paradigm where it's not necessarily like shouldn't go in a gallery. It's like a tool to make the music, which is the artwork. And I feel like her stuff kind of transcends that in a way where she makes these instruments that have functional, have formal elements that guide the function to have an interesting meaning, like this guitar where you can't, you have to play it with another person and it puts you in their intimate space. So it sort of like pushes the functionality, and I think it contains more meaning in a way, which I guess puts this into a more artistic realm for me. So those were the couple things I wanted to show. So now I'd like to just kind of open it up. How much time do we have? Not much, right? 10 minutes. We'll have a very short discussion. We were thinking of having a very casual discussion up here, just kind of, talk back and forth between each other. And let's just start that off. Does anybody have anything that they thought of from someone else's presentation that they'd like to bring up?
Yeah.
Lots of things, yeah. Go for it.
No, like I was actually interested in when you were talking about resilient forms, so forms that maybe have to, I don't know, evolve with time or like recover from disasters or extreme things or things that were not really intended for them to do. So I think that's a really interesting idea. And I wondered whether you could maybe comment on how that reflects on form.
Well, I think one of the interesting things to me that, and Jeff referred to it a little bit, is the fact that we're not really talking about the content or the function so much necessarily. And I think that's kind of a dodge that artists can give themselves, is that for me, I don't really have a goal. It's very difficult for me to evaluate, is the thing being successful or not. To me, I make a thing and I want people to come to it, and I want them to be somehow engaged and excited and confused by it. And to me, it's like, I did it. Whereas what you were just talking about, and what you also, is there's a kind of optimization that can creep in sometimes that you need in certain kinds of projects. You needed a homogeneity to the way things behave in certain times. And earlier, Janet, with things, you don't want them to fall, and et cetera. So I think that's a tension that's always there. And for me, I just purposely position myself where I get to not worry about that. I really purposely make things that are going to fail and are going to fall apart. And that's actually part of what I'm doing and thinking about, is that built-in failure and decay and change over time. So I think it's a choice you can make. And Jeff is struggling with that kind of product versus weird instrument thing. And I think that's related in a lot of ways.
I think it's also interesting because I think in engineering you see at the moment we've gone very long for optimization and making things more efficient and making it do things in a very efficient way. But I think we're realizing more and more that actually we need redundancy, we need resilience. The things that we design and the things that we have in mind, how this is going to be used by the users or the laws that are going to change, we cannot really predict what's going to happen, right? Or we cannot totally imagine, how people would want to use it, or what's going to happen in the next, because in engineering it takes a long time, in the next 50 years. And so there's I think thinking away from very efficient, optimal things to more resilient things where a thing can do more than one thing, right? There's, if some components fail, it doesn't matter because there's all these other, let's say, load paths that could be taken as well.
I'm always amazed when I'm on an airplane, and you were saying you were doing engineering, that airplanes can lose engines and they don't just fall out of the sky. It's like that there are regions where we've done that. We've built these incredible systems, and it's so just every day now. You get in on an airplane, you fly. But if the engine falls off, it doesn't fall out of the sky, hopefully. And that's incredible to me. I don't do that.
I also think this is like, in terms of like, it's an open, art is something that's quite open-ended, that brings a lot of freedom to artists, is that you create the artwork, and then how would people understand it, interpret it, or even as a designer, you design a product, and how would the users, they use it, it's up to them and not up to you, which means sometimes it's good that you just focus on this one thing and make it, but sometimes it make you very vulnerable because sometimes you don't want to be misinterpreted versus like sometimes I work as an engineer as well, and that's like more straightforward. You answer the question, you solve the problem, and there will be a result, even though it's like what you expected or not. It's like it's not open-ended.
I think for us, I was talking to Sigrid last night about this too. And typically in architecture, when we engineer structures and buildings, it has to resist something way beyond what you ever really need. And it's like these extreme conditions, whether it's the 100-mile-per-hour hurricanes to lows to earthquakes, all these things, so that a building will never fall down. But the nice thing is the area that I do and the research is, again, at that really fragile cusp of standing up or not, and how we test it. And even the project that I showed you, we had some serious structural problems because, again, we're testing something very new. And to me, it was like, wow, this is great. But then when I talked to the structural engineer who typically designs for architecture, he was mortified by this whole thing, right? He just thought, this is a disaster. How could this ever happen? I thought, no, this is great. We made one of the most lightweight, optimized, right, type of structure with a certain number of things, and we really tested it to its limit. So to me, it's actually also a goal, I think, in my own work, which is probably less so than application in industry. Because in architecture, it always moves towards that very, very conservative area of engineering.
I'll just say that I'm really uninterested in thinking about function in a sort of positivistic way, that I find it like very normative to be that, this sort of perfect static function that, it works or it doesn't work is, sort of incredibly boring to me in a certain level as an artist. And it's the uncertainty sort of the real slipping into these forms, or that is what makes a big mess. And that uncertainty sort of feels like this death that's going to creep in one way or another. So I actually like to work from that point, just sort of a little bit like what you're saying. But I think I literally feel against thinking about function in a positivistic way. Like, I will say I'm against that, and I don't know, I think that's kind of an interesting tension.
Yeah, I think that also, I think that's a really interesting point, because it's the thing that you expect a function to, is function your goal or is function your method? Because especially in programming, we create functions to do something, and writing that 10 lines of code to create a function is not my goal. My goal is using this function to do something different. So I guess it's also like in your process, what's goal you're aiming for?
Jeff asked us to put together questions that we could ask each other, and just in light of what you were saying, one of the questions I sent kind of picks up on that, and it was a kind of proposed question that would read, is there a way to service the demands of function in the worlds of design and engineering without capitulation to the dehumanizing cults of market-driven service and efficiency?
No.
Right. Right. So that, I'm just like, kind of was like, I was feeling you in that direction with a question like that. By the same token, I am reading this off of a phone that just works like all get out. And, as a historian of science, I am like super interested in how, knowledge of things makes it possible to kind of do things. That sort of dance between knowing stuff and being able to show that you know stuff is so deep in the history of science. Yeah.
I think for me, there's something that I'm often really troubled by, and I think a lot is the kind of cavalier attitude I have, and that I think we've developed society towards. Even the things we make that are functional are not considered permanent anymore. And someone was mentioning earlier that buildings always fall down now. And I think in a way, the kind of thinking we're talking about also feeds into that, and an incredible kind of wastefulness and use of resources, because I say, well, I'm an artist, what I'm doing doesn't really matter, so I can mess around with things, and if they fall apart, it's okay, I'll just make another one, etc. But at the same time, I'm chewing up resources, right? So and I feel like I'm on the side of, okay, what I'm doing is somehow useful in the world, and so I'm keep doing it, but at the same time, I'm always kind of thinking, how can I do this in a way that is less wasteful or less just kind of, haha, I used up another thing of aluminum, or I did whatever, and so I use a lot of recycled materials and things like that, and I try to make things that decay and can exist for a long time. They just exist in different forms, and it's okay. But iPhones and stuff like that, I mean, my God, and buildings that are falling down and all that. So I think that, for me, is a very unsettled question, is what does it mean to be cavalier about longevity or function as an artist? And is it okay that I am that way?
So I would like to kind of both address Marta and what you're saying with a concept that we use in engineering, which is objective functions. So we can have functions, but we actually can also have objective functions. So we're going to design things so they really perform well in something very, very specific. And I think the way that people maybe think about that is that these objective functions, which give you totally optimized things, are, well, first of all, I think they're good because they use very little material. I do stuff where you reduce the amounts of material. But I think you can use all these technology and these functions not in a kind of dehumanized way, but actually you can use them as tools, right? You can use them to make you make informed decisions, right? And I think that is how in engineering we can use all these very maybe, I don't know, algorithms which don't really seem to have any soul or no human input. You could do that. You could press a button and something could come out. But I think the good way to use them is to use that as options and as opportunities to inform the choices that you are going to make. Where I guess when you make choices, you make them on your sensory or on your visual experiences. But I think you can also rely on tools and technologies to inform what you're going to be doing, maybe.
Maybe one last thought. So I'm not going to try to speak for Martha, but I think it's very, there is a sense, I think, among some folks right now that the sort of push down of market-driven forces into sort of every aspect of our subjective and intersubjective lives, driven by the sort of efficiency rationalization programs that have proven so powerful in so many domains of life, poses like a kind of grave, all that poses a grave threat to sort of human being as we've known it. I'll speak for myself in saying that. And it's in that context that sort of resistance to functionality, and if you like, an interest in friction rather than sort of frictionlessness, I think can feel like a really significant form of like critical resistance in some ways right now. So I don't think it needs to speak to how beautiful and powerful the technologies are for solving hard problems and optimizing across, many demands. Either kind of quantitative or material. But I do think that some of that is what motivates my interest in sort of difficult situations in the work that I care about.
Can I say one? I gotta say one. I totally agree. But I want to circle back to what you said, because I don't feel that kind of shame about using materials. I think because, like
Alcoa's way ahead of you, and like Exxon's using so much more stuff that if you use a little stuff.
No, that's not what I was going to say.
Okay. Also, they're like way ahead.
Okay, but that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say that the nacho cheese machine, I would never have noticed it if it wasn't misbehaving. So like the misuse of materials or the non-functional, in a way, use of materials is what leads to progress. Like seeing things, actually looking at things and seeing them requires seeing them out of bounds in a certain way. So what you're doing is helping us to see things in a new way, which ultimately in that moment may not be super progressive, but leads to, you know, in a very sort of philosophical way, new ways of looking. No, I like deeply believe that. So it's not a misuse or a waste, in my opinion.
That's a perfect comment to end on. Oh, we almost avoided having to listen to the rabble, but here we go.
Can't do it.
It's fine. You guys have the next panel.
That's right. That's what she gets to choose because it's our time. We're waiting.
Hello. I just wanted to make one comment. In defense, maybe, of engineering, I think, and maybe this is my perspective in academia, where we have kind of, and a place like Princeton, where we have kind of unending freedom. But I would say that the most creative engineers I know and the most remarkable, awe-inspiring results or output or advances have not been the result of someone being handed a problem, or they have been completely somebody's imagination, somebody's inspiration. I mean, to me, it seems like very similar to the kinds of processes that you use. This idea of drawing inspiration, bumping into a material, or bumping into a piece of mathematics that's so compelling and beautiful, somebody just wants to figure out how to explore it. And they make something and they have no idea what it's going to be used for. And some of these things down the road get used for incredible things, you know, solving the world's problems, and sometimes not. And sometimes they're just beautiful, and there are, you know, many of us who can just appreciate them for the beauty of the ideas and the creativity and the inspiration that's gone into it. So, you know, I don't know if that's art, but it certainly isn't. It isn't this kind of dead end, you solve a problem, there's nothing else. In fact, I think all these kinds of things always lead to new roads, new directions. So that's my little defense.